In this video, I'm going to talk about archival research. I've done a lot of archival research in Soviet documents and other places, archives in the United States. There's some important things to think about when you're gathering and interpreting these kinds of documents. So first, think of all the ways that information gets stored, whether it's in a company or a government, what gets kept, what gets tossed out, where might it be kept, in what form might it be kept, is it classified or declassified. One of the strangest documents that I used in my research for my PhD thesis was if you've ever seen the movie Argo, which is a movie about the American diplomats who were taken hostage in Iran and some that were rescued by a clever scheme. Well, in that movie, they show where the diplomats, when they knew they were about to be taken hostage, were desperately trying to shred documents, but they had a very simple old-fashioned shredder that only cut the documents vertically. So the Iranians took all the shreds and started taping them back together, gluing them back together into documents that they could read. And I wasn't studying Iran, I was studying Afghanistan. But why was I interested in these documents? These documents were published in a book called The Nest of Spies by the Iranians who took the Americans hostage. And why was I interested in these documents? Well, because they were from the embassy in Tehran. And when the U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan would meet with the president of Afghanistan or somebody else, they would send copies of the notes from that meeting, not just to Washington, but also to neighboring embassies that had some interest in Afghanistan across the border. And so there were a lot of documents about Afghanistan, which were then published in these shredded documents. They were basically, had been secret documents, but now they've been revealed by the Iranians, and those were useful to me in my work. So there's lots of strange ways that documents might get preserved or restored or kept. If they're private collections, they may be in somebody's attic or basement or something, or talk to all their living relatives. Think about all the ways that there might be still some information, written information left somewhere. Be aware of the biases in what's made available or not made available. So some of my research is on the Russian interventions in Chechnya. We have, and also Afghanistan, we have lots of documents about the Russian involvement and Soviet involvement in Afghanistan because Yeltsin released those to try to embarrass the Communist Party after Yeltsin took power. So we have a lot of those documents. How many documents do we have about Yeltsin's intervention in Chechnya or Putin's intervention in Chechnya? Basically zero, right? The Russian reporters who start asking too closely about Putin's intervention in Chechnya, they often end up dead. And so we don't have a good, documentary record on that. We may never, right? It may have been destroyed if it even exists on paper, right? So there's all the usual issues of interpreting any information. Who created or wrote it or said it? Because it could have been written by staff, even if it has the other person's name on it. To whom were they saying these things or writing these things? For what purposes, for what instrumental goals, right? So who said what to whom with what purpose? And that's an important part of interpreting the meaning and the implications of these documents, right? When in my work, when Brezhnev met with Carter, and it was during détente, and Brezhnev toasted Carter and said, I'm glad we have this détente relationship. Too bad for you guys that you're imperialists and you're going to just lose the battle of history and we're going to kick you out of the developing world through national liberation to your health, right? So you'd think at a diplomatic meeting he wouldn't be going out of his way to sort of shove it in Carter's face that national liberations were turning pro-Soviet in the third world. But there it was. To him, to Brezhnev, that was kind of just part of history, the inevitable triumph of communism over capitalism, just as Marx described. And to Carter, that was a very, insulting kind of a view. So triangulate between, what people say in public and what they write or say in private, or triangulate between what you get from interviews and what you get from documents. A really good example of this is the work of Yen-Fun Kong in the book called Analogies of War. And he's looking at how American decision makers during the Vietnam War used different analogies. And some used the analogy of the French in Dien Bien Phu as a cautionary tale that the U.S. should not get too involved in Vietnam. And others use the analogy of the Munich crisis and argue that if we don't take a tough stand in Vietnam, we're going to have this whole series of dominoes and the communists are going to win all throughout Asia. So one of his questions was, are these analogies that people only use in public when they're trying to convince people, or are these actually things that they use in private? Now, even if they're using them in private meetings, they still may be using them to convince other people in the group. But he found a very close correspondence on almost every issue between what people were saying in public and how they spoke in internal classified meetings that were later declassified. So triangulate, as I said, between interviews as well. It can be useful to get different notes on the same meeting and different documents on the same meeting. A great example is the documents we have about meetings between Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev toward the end of the Cold War. And the British version of those notes was released first, eventually declassified, but it was redacted. In other words, large parts of it were blacked out because those were issues that were still potentially classified or maybe just potentially embarrassing to Thatcher and the British government. Well, when the Soviet version eventually came out and got declassified, well, the things that were embarrassing to the British were not embarrassing to the Soviets, to the Russians. And so it was all in there. All the redacted parts of the British version were all in there in the Soviet documents. And what were those redacted parts? Those were where Thatcher is telling Gorbachev that maybe he should fight harder to slow down the process of German unification, because Thatcher felt that the British had had some issues with the Germans over the last century, and she didn't want to see too powerful a Germany too quickly. Now, of course, that was directly contrary to the official policy of the United States and NATO, who wanted to move very quickly to unify Germany under a Western democratic government. And so it's very interesting to find this in the Soviet documents, right? So if you think, oh, I've already seen the notes from that meeting, well, you haven't seen this person's notes from that meeting, which may be very different, right? So when you go to an archive, be nice to the archivist, right? They sometimes are very protective of their documents. They want to make sure you're not going to spill your coffee on them or lose them or walk off with them or whatever else, right? So reassure them, help them do their jobs, and they'll help you do yours. A little chocolate is the universal language, and it goes a long way if you're visiting some foreign archive, or some other kind of little gift might be nice. Don't be overawed by secret documents. I would find myself sometimes reading these declassified documents, and I get all excited, and then I would say, wait a minute, I actually already knew that from just reading the newspapers from that time period. And so, again, triangulate between the public media and the private stuff. And there will be some stuff that's in the private stuff that's not in the public, but don't get carried away. Just because it was secret doesn't mean it's really useful or interesting or important. A lot of things, especially in the US government, get classified that are really very mundane things. You can now easily photograph the documents. You might want to get a stand for doing that. Make sure you have a good setup with your camera, whatever else, that they're legible. There's some ways, I haven't worked myself with softwares, but there's some softwares where you can go from photographs to digitized readable text, and that can be very useful for searching through a lot of text for certain keywords and so on. So you might look into that. Again, I haven't done that myself. Okay, so that's some ideas about archival research. Let me give you two fun exercises here that come from some of my sort of best hits, favorite documents from my research on Soviet military interventions. So one is a Совершенно секретно, top secret notes from a Politburo meeting. The Politburo is the highest decision-making body in the Soviet Union. It includes their general secretary, Brezhnev in this case. And these are the notes from that meeting that were later released, in part to embarrass the Communist Party. Yeltsin released them, but some of them were released just because a reporter paid a couple $100 for them. When before in the Cold War we would have spent millions of dollars and risked lives to get these. Now they're just on sale on the streets of Moscow, but they're authentic, right? So this document, which is the next slide, it's in Russian and it's handwritten. But I think there's some things you might notice that are strange about it, even if you don't read Russian, and the handwriting is difficult to read even if you do. So I want you to look in particular this document. There's some scrawled writing at a diagonal in the document. And I want to ask you to think about, what do you think that is? What is that scrawled writing? And what might it tell us about this decision that is, it's an important decision. They're going to send what eventually becomes 100,000 troops into Afghanistan, right? So even if you don't read Russian, what is your guess as to what that scrawled diagonal writing is, and what does it tell us? That's the first exercise. So here is that document. You might pause the video and take a look at it. Here's the scroll. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Here's the scrawled writing I'm talking about here. Okay. Here's the second exercise. One of the questions in my research on Soviet military interventions is, do Soviet leaders actually believe in private the things they're saying in public about Marxism, Leninism, and national liberation and all this, right? And so there's a particularly interesting document in that regard, which is a conversation between a member of the Soviet Politburo, Kosygin, and the head of the Communist Party in Afghanistan, basically the leader of the government in Afghanistan, Taraki. And this conversation is in March 1979. It's about 8 or 9 months before the Soviet Union invaded in force in December 1979. And in March, there was an uprising in the city of Herat where Mujahideen, anti-Soviet Mujahideen, had killed a number of Soviet advisors and were literally walking around town with their heads on sharp stakes. And so the Soviets were trying to decide what they should do about this. Should they intervene militarily or not? Should they try to keep the hands off and let the Afghan government deal with it? And so this is a critical juncture where Kosygin is talking to Taraki. Now, I've given you a link here for that document. If you're taking a class with me, I'll give you a Google document that gives you the link so you don't have to write it out. But take a look at that document. It's only about a page. And ask yourself, what's strange about this conversation between Kosygin and Taraki, and what does it tell you about Kosygin's understanding or misunderstanding of Afghanistan, and what does it tell you more generally about this bigger question I have about whether they actually believe some of the stuff in private that they've been saying in public? Have they actually drunk their own Kool-Aid about Marxist-Leninist ideology? Okay, so take a look at that document, read it closely, and see what you think.